In a frozen world, the most urgent concern at the start of each day was not hunger, but whether warmth still remained. Fire was fragile, easily weakened by moisture, wind, and cold air, and once lost, it demanded great effort to restore. People understood that warmth only reached them by Allah's permission through simple means, so fire was treated carefully, not casually. Embers were valued more than flames, because they represented continuity. Without fire, food could not be softened, tools could not be warmed, and rest became difficult. This quiet dependence shaped daily life, turning attention toward preservation rather than creation, and encouraging calm routines instead of rushed action. Fire was rarely rebuilt from nothing if it could be avoided. Creating flame from scratch required dry materials, steady hands, and time, all of which were harder to gather in freezing conditions. Instead, people focused on keeping embers alive across hours and nights. These glowing remnants were sheltered under ash, where heat lingered longer. Ash acted as insulation, slowing heat loss while protecting embers from wind. Each morning, the first task was often uncovering this warmth, checking whether the ember still breathed faintly. That moment determined the pace of the day, reminding people that yesterday's care shaped today's comfort. Wind was among the greatest threats to fire. Even a strong flame could weaken quickly when exposed to moving air. People learned to read wind patterns, noticing how it flowed around stones, slopes, and shelter walls. Fires were positioned carefully, never randomly. Small adjustments made large differences. Shifting a hearth a short distance could transform unstable flame into steady heat. This awareness required observation rather than force. Fire survived not because it was powerful, but because it was protected. This lesson echoed through daily habits, reinforcing patience and attentiveness over urgency. Moisture presented another challenge. Snowmelt, damp wood, and frozen ground all worked against sustained fire. Fuel gathered carelessly produced smoke without heat, wasting effort and irritating the eyes. People learned to distinguish usable material by touch and sound, testing dryness before committing it to embers. Wet fuel was sometimes dried slowly near warmth before use. This process took time, but saved resources. Fire responded best to respect, not haste. Through experience, people accepted that progress in cold environments happened gradually, through small, careful steps. Embers were sometimes carried from place to place when groups moved. Warm coals were wrapped in bark, hide, or moss, materials that trapped heat while limiting airflow. This portable warmth allowed fire to travel short distances without restarting. Carrying embers required constant attention. Too much air caused them to burn out. Too little smothered them. This balance demanded calm handling. Fire became something guarded like food, not treated as scenery. The effort reminded people that warmth was not guaranteed, only maintained through responsibility. Night demanded special preparation. As darkness approached, fires were reduced rather than expanded. Large flames consumed fuel quickly and left nothing for morning. Instead, people gathered embers together, covering them with ash and stone. This preserved warmth longer and reduced exposure to wind. The night fire was quiet, almost hidden. Its purpose was not light, but continuity. While bodies rested, embers waited. The next day depended on this patience. Care taken before sleep often determined whether warmth greeted waking hands or whether hardship followed. Fire also required dedicated attention. Someone often remained nearby, listening and watching rather than sleeping deeply. This role was not dramatic. It involved small adjustments, gentle feeding, and awareness of changes in sound or glow. The watcher responded early to problems, preventing collapse rather than repairing loss. This quiet responsibility was valued because it protected everyone. Fire demanded presence, not strength. This presence created rhythm, anchoring the group through long frozen nights where time moved slowly. The sounds of fire carried information. A steady crackle suggested balanced heat. Sudden silence warned of fading embers. Loud snapping hinted at moisture or instability. People learned to listen carefully. Sight alone was unreliable in darkness or blowing snow. Sound guided action. This listening slowed thought and encouraged focus. Fire became a teacher, offering feedback through subtle cues. Responding calmly preserved warmth. Ignoring these signs invited difficulty. Attention replaced urgency as the primary skill. Shelter design supported fire survival. Cooking and heating areas were positioned where airflow could be controlled. Openings allowed smoke to escape without inviting strong drafts. Walls of stone, hide, or packed snow-softened wind. These structures were modest but effective. They did not stop cold entirely, but reduced its force. Fire survived longer within these calmer pockets. People learned that protection mattered more than intensity. A small sheltered fire outlasted a large exposed one. Fuel placement mattered as much as fuel choice. Adding too much at once overwhelmed embers and produced smoke. Too little allowed fire to fade. People fed embers slowly, watching response before adding more. This steady feeding conserved resources. Fire rewarded patience. This approach shaped cooking later, favoring methods that matched slow heat. Fire did not rush, and people learned not to rush it either. Cold air made fingers stiff and reduced dexterity. Fire therefore served as a tool for maintaining movement. Hands were warmed periodically during tending. This prevented mistakes and injury. Care for fire and care for the body were linked. Neglecting one affected the other. Warmth supported attention, and attention supported warmth. This loop reinforced careful pacing. Fire demanded balance, not sacrifice. During storms, fire survival became more difficult. Wind shifted unpredictably, and snow threatened to bury embers. People responded by narrowing hearths, adding shields, or relocating fire within shelter if possible. These adjustments were done quietly. Panic wasted heat and energy. Experience taught that small calm changes preserved fire better than dramatic action. Fire endured storms through protection, not resistance. Fire was never assumed permanent. People understood it could fail despite effort. This awareness encouraged humility and preparedness. Backup fuel was kept ready. Embers were checked often. Loss was accepted as possible, not shocking. This mindset reduced stress and allowed clearer thinking when difficulties arose. Fire was respected, not trusted blindly. The presence of fire shaped time perception. Activities slowed to match its pace. Cooking, preparation, and rest aligned with heat availability. This rhythm calmed the group. Fire became a quiet center, not demanding attention constantly, but guiding behavior subtly. Life arranged itself around its needs. Children learned fire care by observation. They watched where elders placed fuel and how they reacted to changes. Instruction was minimal. Knowledge transferred through repetition and example. This method preserved consistency. Fire traditions remained stable because they were practiced daily, not explained once. Mistakes taught restraint. Fires that burned too fast or died too early reinforced careful habits. Lessons were remembered because consequences were immediate. Fire did not allow careless repetition. This feedback strengthened discipline without words. As hours passed, embers dimmed gradually. This dimming signaled rest rather than loss. Covering embers marked transition, not ending. Fire entered a waiting state. People learned to trust this quiet phase. Stillness did not mean failure. It meant preparation for renewal. In deep cold, fire represented continuity more than comfort. It connected days, meals, and rest into a single flow. Losing it broke that flow. Preserving it maintained stability. Fire became less about warmth itself and more about preserving rhythm. This quiet problem shaped frozen life deeply. Keeping fire alive required patience, awareness, and moderation. These qualities extended beyond the hearth, influencing movement, storage, and planning. Fire survived not through dominance, but through care. And so, as embers rested beneath ash, warmth lingered without promise of permanence. Fire remained only as long as it was tended. Enough warmth endured for the moment, until care or neglect determined what followed next. In a frozen world, preparing food began long before anything touched fire, because choosing the right place to cook often determined whether warmth could be maintained at all. Cooking in the open exposed flames to wind, snow, and sudden temperature shifts that wasted fuel and effort. People learned to search for calmer spaces where air moved slowly and predictably. These places did not remove the cold, but they reduced its force. A well-chosen cooking spot allowed fire to survive longer with less fuel. This awareness shaped daily movement, as people observed terrain carefully, noticing subtle changes in wind and ground that made certain locations more suitable than others. Wind direction influenced nearly every cooking decision. Even a small draft could weaken embers or scatter heat unevenly. People watched how snow drifted and how smoke bent in the air to understand wind behavior. A cooking place was often selected behind a natural barrier such as a rock outcrop, a slope, or a stand of dense brush. These barriers softened airflow rather than stopping it completely. Calm air allowed heat to rise steadily instead of being pulled away. Over time, people recognized familiar wind patterns and returned to locations that consistently offered protection, reinforcing the importance of observation rather than chance. Stone walls became one of the most reliable ways to shield cooking fires. Stones were stacked loosely, allowing small gaps that reduced pressure from wind while still blocking its force. These walls reflected heat inward, concentrating warmth where food was prepared. The stones themselves were ordinary, but their usefulness came by Allah's permission through physical properties that people learned to respect. Stone walls were adjusted frequently as wind shifted or stones settled. Their flexibility mattered more than their height. Even a low wall could make the difference between steady heat and constant struggle. When stone was unavailable, packed snow served a similar purpose. Snow walls were shaped carefully, not too thick and not too thin. Thick walls absorbed heat unnecessarily, while thin ones collapsed easily. Snow reflected warmth inward while blocking wind surprisingly well. However, snow structures required constant attention. Temperature changes caused melting and refreezing, altering shape and strength. People repaired snow walls often, smoothing cracks and rebuilding sections quietly. This maintenance became part of routine rather than a special task, reinforcing patience and steady effort. Cooking places were often located near shelters, but never directly inside without ventilation. Smoke needed a clear path to escape, otherwise it filled enclosed spaces and made breathing difficult. People positioned hearths near entrances or openings where smoke could drift outward while heat remained inside. This balance required careful placement. Too close to an opening invited wind. Too far trapped smoke. Through experience, people learned the best distances, creating cooking spaces that felt calm and breathable even in deep cold. Inside shelters, cooking areas were modest and defined by habit rather than structure. A shallow pit or cleared patch of ground marked the hearth's place. Over time, the ground hardened and darkened, becoming familiar underfoot. These familiar spots reduced effort, as hands and bodies remembered where to move. Familiarity created calm. Even when shelters were temporary, cooking areas were recreated in similar positions, preserving routine despite changing surroundings. Ground conditions mattered as much as wind. Cooking on frozen ground required stability, because shifting ice or melting patches could disrupt fire placement. People avoided areas where snowmelt collected or where ice cracked under weight. Slightly raised ground was preferred, allowing water to drain away naturally. This prevented flooding and reduced steam that could weaken fire. Choosing stable ground protected both fire and food, reducing interruptions during preparation. Cooking places were chosen with fuel access in mind. Carrying fuel long distances wasted energy. A good cooking spot balanced shelter with proximity to fuel sources. People noticed where dry material collected naturally, such as along ridges or under overhangs. This reduced travel and exposure to cold. Efficient placement conserved strength and allowed more attention to remain on fire care rather than constant gathering. Visibility also influenced placement. Cooking required enough light to handle tools safely. Daylight was preferred for preparation, while firelight was reserved for warmth and finishing tasks. Cooking spots that received indirect light were valued. Shadows mattered less than glare. Excessive brightness from snow reflection could strain eyes, while deep shadow made precision difficult. Balanced light supported steady work. Sound played a role as well. Sheltered cooking areas were quieter. Reduced wind noise made it easier to hear changes in fire behavior. Crackling embers and shifting fuel provided cues that guided action. Quiet environments supported attention and reduced fatigue. Cooking places that muffled sound felt calmer and more controlled. Over time, certain locations became known as reliable cooking spots. These places were returned to season after season. Knowledge accumulated through repeated use. People remembered which areas stayed calm during storms and which failed under pressure. This memory guided future decisions, reducing uncertainty. Temporary camps required quick judgment. People learned to assess terrain rapidly, identifying potential windbreaks and ground stability within moments. This skill developed through repetition. Cooking places were chosen efficiently without haste. Calm evaluation saved effort later. In severe weather, cooking locations sometimes shifted during use. Wind direction could change suddenly. People responded by adjusting walls, moving hearth slightly, or narrowing fire size. These adjustments were quiet and deliberate. Flexibility mattered more than perfection. Cooking spaces also influenced social arrangement. People gathered where warmth held steady. Seating positions formed naturally around sheltered hearths. These patterns supported shared meals and quiet rest. Cooking places became centers of calm activity. Fire behavior differed depending on enclosure. Sheltered fires burned more evenly and produced less smoke. This improved comfort and reduced irritation. Food cooked more predictably. These benefits reinforced careful placement. Even when conditions were harsh, a well-chosen cooking place created a sense of order. Within that small protected space, tasks unfolded smoothly. Outside, the cold remained unchanged. The effort spent choosing a good spot reduced later strain. Preparation replaced reaction. This shift mattered deeply in frozen environments. Cooking places were never permanent. They existed only as long as needed. Once abandoned, they returned to stillness. Nothing about these kitchens was decorative. Their value lay in function. Shelter, warmth, and calm mattered more than appearance. And so, by choosing cooking places carefully, people shaped pockets of stability within a frozen world, allowing fire to work quietly and food to be prepared with patience before cold reclaimed the land once more. In a frozen world, food preparation began with cutting and cleaning long before cooking heat was applied, because once food froze solid, handling it became far more difficult. Preparation required calm focus, steady hands, and careful timing. People chose places near the hearth where light was steady and warmth prevented fingers from stiffening too quickly. Cutting was never rushed, because mistakes wasted both food and energy. Clean preparation reduced later effort, allowing cooking to proceed smoothly. This stage shaped the entire meal, turning raw resources into something manageable. The quiet discipline of preparation reflected a deep understanding that careful beginnings reduced hardship later, especially in cold environments where recovery from error was slow. Without sinks or flowing water, cleaning relied on simple methods shaped by experience. Snow, cold water, and scraping tools replaced washing as we know it today. Clean snow was used to wipe hands and food surfaces, removing residue quickly before fingers numbed. Cold water rinses were brief, followed by warming hands near embers to restore movement. These methods were effective by Allah's permission, using natural properties rather than excess. Cleanliness was practical, not ceremonial. Dirty tools froze quickly, making them unusable. Clean tools stayed functional. Preparation therefore moved in cycles of cut, clean, warm, and pause, creating a steady rhythm that conserved strength. Flat stones served as cutting surfaces, chosen for smoothness and stability. A good stone stayed level and resisted cracking in cold. These stones were positioned close enough to warmth to prevent food from freezing solid, yet far enough to avoid heat damage. When one surface became too cold or slick, the stone was turned or replaced. Stones were scraped clean rather than washed, conserving water and preventing ice buildup. Over time, preferred stones became familiar, recognized by feel. These simple surfaces anchored preparation, offering reliability in an environment where many things remained unpredictable. Cutting tools were simple but effective. Sharp flakes of stone provided clean edges capable of slicing meat, fat, and sinew. These tools demanded control rather than force. Slow, deliberate movements reduced slipping, especially when surfaces hardened with cold. Blades were wiped frequently to prevent residue from freezing onto edges. A dull or dirty blade increased effort and risk. Tools were warmed briefly near embers when needed, restoring usability. This care extended tool life and reduced waste. Preparation rewarded attentiveness, not strength, reinforcing a calm approach to work. Hands required constant attention. Cold numbed fingers quickly, reducing precision. People paused often to warm hands near the fire, restoring sensation before continuing. This prevented accidents and preserved fine control. Ignoring cold led to mistakes that cost food or caused injury. Preparation therefore unfolded in short focused intervals rather than long continuous effort. These pauses were not inefficiency but strategy. Maintaining dexterity mattered more than speed. The body was treated as part of the process, not separate from it. Frozen meat behaved differently than fresh meat. It resisted cutting and fractured unpredictably. People learned to work with structure rather than against it, cutting along natural seams, joints, and muscle lines. Using anatomy reduced effort and improved results. This approach conserved energy and preserved usable pieces. Knowledge of structure guided every cut, turning preparation into an act of understanding rather than force. These skills developed through repetition and observation, passed quietly through example rather than explanation. Fat was handled with particular care. It provided essential energy and cooking aid, so it was scraped gently and set aside rather than discarded. Fat froze quickly, becoming brittle, so it was shaped while still flexible. Even small amounts mattered. Handling fat carefully reduced waste and supported later cooking methods. This attention reflected a broader respect for resources. Nothing useful was treated lightly. Bones were processed deliberately. Rather than striking randomly, people cracked bones using controlled pressure against stones. This prevented shattering and preserved marrow. Marrow offered valuable nourishment and warmth. Clean breaks reduced mess and simplified later handling. Bone processing required patience and accuracy, reinforcing slow technique over forceful action. Cleaning tools after use was essential. Residue left on blades froze quickly, damaging edges and increasing effort later. Tools were wiped clean immediately and stored in dry places. This habit preserved functionality and reduced preparation time for the next meal. Maintenance became routine, not extra work. Preparation favored daylight because natural light reduced mistakes that could waste food or cause injury, especially when hands were cold and movements required precision. Daylight allowed clear visibility of textures, edges, and tool placement without relying heavily on firelight. Firelight was therefore reserved for warmth and later cooking stages rather than detailed cutting work. This separation conserved fuel and reduced eye strain caused by flickering light reflecting off snow or stone. Preparing food while the sun was still present also created a smoother transition into evening routines. By completing demanding tasks early, people entered colder hours with less pressure, allowing nights to focus on warmth, rest, and maintaining fire rather than difficult preparation. Conversation during preparation was intentionally limited, not because interaction was discouraged, but because silence supported steady focus. Cutting and cleaning required attention to detail, and unnecessary talk increased distraction and risk. Quiet allowed people to hear subtle sounds, such as scraping tools or shifting surfaces, which signaled when adjustments were needed. The environment itself was already loud with wind or fire, so reducing human noise helped maintain awareness. This calm atmosphere reduced mental strain and preserved energy. Silence became part of the routine, creating a focused space where preparation unfolded smoothly, guided by rhythm rather than urgency or discussion. Cold air helped preserve food briefly during preparation, but exposure still required control. Food left uncovered for too long could freeze too hard or collect snow and debris. To prevent this, portions were grouped and covered whenever they were not actively being worked on. Coverings protected surfaces while allowing air circulation, preventing excessive moisture buildup. Organization mattered because it reduced repeated handling, which wasted warmth and energy. By keeping food arranged and protected, preparation remained efficient. These habits minimized contamination and ensured that food stayed workable, balancing preservation with accessibility in cold conditions. Prepared portions were arranged deliberately according to how they would be used later. Pieces meant for immediate cooking were placed closer to warmth, while those intended for storage were set aside in colder areas. This organization simplified later steps, reducing confusion and unnecessary movement. Knowing exactly where each portion belonged saved time and conserved energy. Clear arrangement also prevented accidental thawing or freezing at the wrong stage. Preparation extended beyond cutting itself, shaping how smoothly cooking and storage would proceed. This structured layout reflected planning rather than abundance, ensuring that each piece of food followed a clear path forward. Younger members learned preparation skills primarily through observation rather than instruction. Watching elders cut, clean, and organize food taught technique more effectively than explanation. Repetition reinforced understanding. By seeing the same motions performed calmly and consistently, skills were absorbed naturally. This method preserved uniform habits across the group, reducing variation that could cause mistakes. Learning through observation also maintained quiet during preparation, supporting focus. Over time, movements became familiar, allowing skills to develop without formal teaching, ensuring continuity of knowledge across generations. Speed was never treated as a goal during preparation. Moving too quickly increased the risk of slipping, wasting food, or damaging tools. Precision mattered more than finishing early. Slow, deliberate actions conserved energy and produced better results. This mindset shaped preparation routines, encouraging patience and restraint. By prioritizing accuracy over speed, people reduced errors that required correction later. This approach aligned with the realities of cold environments, where recovery from mistakes demanded extra effort. Slowness became a form of efficiency, not delay. Mistakes, when they occurred, taught restraint rather than frustration. A poor cut or dropped piece of food had immediate consequences, reinforcing careful habits. Instead of reacting with urgency, people adjusted technique and pace. This response prevented repeated error and preserved morale. Learning came through correction, not blame. Each mistake refined awareness, strengthening discipline over time. Preparation became more reliable as habits adjusted naturally. The cold environment did not forgive repeated errors, so restraint became essential, guiding behavior towards steadiness rather than reaction. Preparation grounded the day by giving hands clear purpose while allowing the mind to settle. Repetitive motions reduced mental noise, replacing scattered thought with focus. This grounding effect mattered deeply in harsh conditions, where stress could build quickly. Cutting and cleaning offered structure, dividing the day into manageable phases. As hands worked steadily, the mind followed the same rhythm. Preparation became both practical and calming, anchoring daily life in predictable action. The rhythm of cutting and cleaning created order within uncertainty. Predictable motions reduced decision fatigue and mental strain. Each step followed the last without rush. This rhythm supported consistency, making preparation reliable even when conditions outside were harsh or unpredictable. Order emerged through repetition rather than control. These routines stabilized daily life, allowing people to function calmly despite cold, darkness, and limited resources. Preparation bridged the stillness of cold and the warmth of cooking. It transformed raw, frozen resources into readiness. This transition was neither dramatic nor hurried. Preparation softened the shift between environments, preparing both food and people for the next stage. By the time heat was applied, much of the work was already complete, reducing stress and effort. And as prepared food rested beside the hearth, carefully arranged and protected, the frozen world seemed to pause. There was a brief moment of quiet before cooking began, where effort eased and warmth waited. Preparation had done its work, allowing patience and heat to carry the process forward without urgency. In a frozen world, fuel determined what could be cooked, how it could be cooked, and when it could be cooked. Warmth reached people only by Allah's permission through simple means, and fuel was one of those means that could not be wasted. A fire was not a constant presence but a planned resource. People thought in terms of a fuel budget even without numbers, because every branch, root, or piece of driftwood represented time, exposure, and effort. Cooking therefore began with decisions about fuel. How much could be spent today, how much must be saved for night, and how to avoid burning more than necessary. Fuel gathering required strategy. In many cold regions, large trees were scarce and could be wet or buried under snow. People searched for dry sources such as wind-fallen branches, sheltered roots, or driftwood that had dried before freeze. They tested pieces by weight and sound, choosing wood that felt light and snapped cleanly rather than bending. Damp fuel smoked heavily and produced less heat, wasting energy and irritating the eyes. Gathering also had to balance risk, because long trips exposed bodies to cold. Efficient fuel collection reduced danger and preserved strength for cooking and other work. Fuel storage mattered as much as fuel gathering. Dry material was protected from snow and moisture, sometimes tucked under hides, placed against stones, or raised off the ground. Even small efforts to keep fuel dry improved fire quality later. Wet fuel demanded more heat to dry before it could burn well, increasing total consumption. Storing fuel near the cooking place reduced trips and minimized exposure. This was not convenience alone. It was efficiency. A well-prepared fuel stash made cooking calmer, allowing people to focus on food rather than constant scrambling for burnable material. In cold conditions, people avoided building large flames unless necessary. Large flames looked impressive but consumed fuel quickly. Embers provided steadier heat for longer. For cooking, embers were often more useful than flames. Fires were therefore managed intentionally. Fuel was allowed to burn down, coals were spread evenly, and food was positioned where heat was stable. This style of fire supported slow cooking and conserved resources. Fire became quiet, controlled, and economical, matching the demands of scarcity. The pace of cooking was shaped by the pace of fuel. Fast cooking methods required intense heat and therefore more fuel. Slow methods could use gentle heat for longer with less consumption. People learned to choose techniques that matched what they could afford. When fuel was limited, meals were planned around efficiency, thinner cuts, smaller portions, and methods that trapped heat. This planning prevented crisis later. Instead of reacting to hunger with urgency, people responded with foresight, shaping meals to fit available resources. Even the act of feeding a fire reflected fuel budgeting. Adding too much fuel at once caused flames to rise and waste heat. Adding too little allowed fire to fade. People fed fires in small increments, watching how coals responded. This produced steady warmth with minimal smoke. It also reduced risk of sudden flare-ups that could damage food or shelter. Fire tending became a quiet practice of balance, guided by attention rather than force. This careful feeding stretched fuel across hours, making warmth last longer than it otherwise would. Ash and embers were treated as stored value. Hot coals buried beneath ash stayed warm longer, allowing fires to rest without dying completely. This reduced the need to restart fires, which was expensive in time and effort. Ash acted as insulation, and people used it intentionally. Coals were gathered, covered, and protected from wind. In the morning, these coals could be revived with minimal fuel. This practice turned yesterday's fire into tomorrow's advantage, reinforcing continuity through disciplined care. Food choices were influenced by fuel availability. Some foods needed long cooking to become soft and edible. Others cooked quickly. People planned meals based on what the fire could sustain. Tough cuts might be cooked when fuel supply was stronger or when slow methods could be used. Quick foods were reserved for times when fuel was scarce. This flexible planning reduced waste. It also ensured that limited fuel produced maximum nourishment. Cooking decisions were therefore grounded in realism rather than preference. Fat played a practical role in fuel budgeting. Rendered fat could support cooking by adding energy and helping heat transfer. However, fat was not treated as an endless resource. It was handled carefully and used moderately. When fat dripped onto coals, it could create flare-ups and smoke, wasting heat. People learned to manage this, controlling distance and timing. Fat's usefulness came by Allah's permission through physical properties, and it was treated as a tool that supported cooking rather than replacing fuel entirely. Shelter design also affected fuel use. A sheltered hearth retained heat better than an exposed one. Windbreaks reduced heat loss and allowed smaller fires to do more work. Cooking in a protected space reduced total fuel needed. This encouraged people to invest effort in simple barriers of stone or snow. The goal was not comfort alone, but efficiency. A calm pocket of air turned limited fuel into sustained warmth. Fuel budgeting encouraged cooperation. Gathering, storing, and tending fire required shared effort. People distributed tasks to reduce strain. Someone gathered fuel while another prepared food, and someone else tended embers. This division of labor reduced wasted movement and helped maintain steady routines. Cooperation also reduced risk. Fewer long trips were needed when fuel was collected efficiently. Shared planning made fuel use more predictable. Weather influenced fuel choices. After storms, dry fuel might be harder to find. People adapted by using smaller fires and more heat-trapping methods. In calmer weather, they might gather extra fuel for future storms. This planning reduced vulnerability. Fuel budgeting therefore extended beyond daily meals. It shaped longer-term decisions, helping groups endure changing conditions without constant crisis. People developed an internal sense of fuel timing. They knew how long certain pieces burned and how quickly coals faded. This knowledge came through repetition. Estimating burn time allowed better cooking plans. It prevented situations where food was half-cooked when fuel ran out. This awareness reduced stress. Fire became predictable when managed carefully, and predictability supported calm routines in harsh environments. Even tool maintenance connected to fuel budgeting. A sharp blade reduced preparation time and reduced the need to keep fires burning longer. Efficient cutting saved heat. Clean, functional tools supported faster transitions from preparation to cooking, conserving fuel indirectly. This shows how fuel budgeting shaped the entire system. Nothing was isolated. Small efficiencies accumulated. Cooking spaces were organized to reduce heat loss. Food, tools, and fuel were placed within reach. This prevented frequent movement in and out of warmth, which wasted energy. Efficient layout conserved both human strength and fire heat. Organization therefore acted as a quiet form of fuel conservation. As you listen, you may notice how scarcity creates calm routines rather than chaos when handled with discipline. Fuel budgeting encouraged patience, planning, and steadiness. The mind could rest when the system was reliable. Mistakes with fuel were costly. A fire that burned too high wasted resources quickly. A fire that died required expensive rebuilding. These consequences reinforced careful habits. Over time, people learned restraint naturally. The environment taught discipline. Fuel budgeting also influenced meal timing. Cooking was often done when it aligned with other tasks, reducing repeated fire use. Instead of lighting fires many times, people clustered activities around one sustained warmth period. This saved fuel and effort. In this way, fire became a quiet measure of the day. Its strength guided choices. People listened to what the fire could afford rather than what appetite demanded. This alignment reduced waste and increased stability. And so, in a frozen world, cooking was shaped by the fuel budget. Heat was conserved, embers were protected, and meals were planned around scarcity. Enough warmth remained for the moment, as long as care and moderation guided every decision. In a frozen world, stone boiling offered a calm solution when direct flames were risky or when containers could not sit on fire. The method was simple in appearance but careful in practice. Water and ingredients were heated using stones warmed in a hearth, then transferred into liquid to release heat slowly. Warmth reaches people only by Allah's permission through physical means, and stone boiling used that means with restraint. The technique reduced the need for constant open flame, helped conserve fuel, and created hot broth that warmed the body deeply. It also turned small scraps into nourishing food, making it valuable during long cold periods when resources were limited. Selecting stones was the first quiet skill. Not every stone could handle repeated heating. People preferred dense, dry stones that had proven stable over time. Stones collected from damp ground or near water sometimes held hidden moisture, which could crack violently when heated. Experience taught which surfaces and textures were safer. Some groups returned to the same reliable stones again and again, recognizing them by weight and feel. This selection was not guesswork. It was careful observation built through repetition, because a cracked stone could spoil a meal, waste fuel, and create danger near hands and faces. Before stones were fully trusted, they were often tested gently. A stone might be warmed at the edge of the hearth first, not placed directly into the hottest coals. If it held together, it could be heated more strongly later. This gradual testing reduced loss and improved safety. Cracks, popping sounds, or flaking surfaces were warnings. A stone that failed once was avoided later. These small decisions saved time and effort in the long run, allowing the cooking system to remain reliable. In cold environments, reliability mattered more than speed, because repeated failure drained energy quickly. Heating stones required patience. Stones were placed where heat rose steadily, then moved closer to embers as they warmed. Rushing the process increased cracking risk. Gradual heating allowed moisture to escape and reduced internal stress. The fire for heating stones was kept controlled, because intense flames wasted fuel and created soot. Embers provided a consistent heat source. This quiet approach matched the overall rhythm of stone boiling. The goal was not dramatic fire but dependable warmth, stored inside stone, ready to be carried into a container without burning it. Containers used for stone boiling were often made from materials that could hold water but could not touch flame directly. Thick hide, bark vessels, or carved wooden bowls could hold liquid, yet would scorch if placed on embers. Stone boiling solved that problem by moving heat into the liquid instead of moving the container into the fire. These containers were practical tools, not permanent objects. Their usefulness depended on careful handling and on Allah's permission, allowing ordinary materials to serve human needs through simple physical properties. A container stayed usable longer when heat was introduced indirectly and gently. Water sources shaped the process. In many frozen places, liquid water was limited, so snow and ice were melted first. Clean snow was preferred, gathered from undisturbed areas to avoid grit and contamination. Melting snow required time and fuel, so water was handled carefully. When water was scarce, stone boiling helped avoid loss because the container could be kept stable and protected while heat was added in small controlled steps. The cooking system depended on keeping the liquid inside, because spilled water meant wasted fuel and fewer meals. Ingredients were prepared with the later simmer in mind. Tough meat, connective tissue, and bone scraps were ideal for broth because gentle heat softened fibers and released fat. Small portions cooked more evenly. Anything that could contribute flavor or nourishment was considered, including marrow-bearing bones and fat trimmings. Ingredients were placed so they would not float and spill when stones entered. Careful arrangement reduced splashing and protected the container. This preparation stage made the later steps calmer. When everything was placed thoughtfully, cooking became a slow unfolding rather than a series of hurried corrections. Handling hot stones demanded simple tools and steady attention. Wooden tongs, bone implements, or forked sticks could lift stones from embers without burning hands. The grip had to be secure. Dropping a stone could tear a hide container or crack a wooden bowl. People moved slowly, letting excess ash fall away before the stone approached the liquid. This reduced grit in the broth. It also prevented sudden steam bursts. These details mattered because cold environments punished injuries. Safe handling preserved both the meal and the cook's ability to work the next day. The first stone entering water was a quiet turning point. Heat moved instantly into liquid, creating soft bubbling and steam. The container remained still while warmth spread outward. This moment required control, because placing stones too quickly could cause overflow. Too many stones could bring a sudden boil that damaged ingredients or weakened the container's edges. People learned to add one stone at a time, watching the response, then adjusting the pace. The method relied on gentle increments, turning stored heat into steady simmer rather than forcing a rapid boil. Stone boiling often worked as a cycle. While one stone released heat into the broth, another stone warmed in the hearth. When the first cooled, it was removed and replaced. This rotation maintained temperature without requiring a large sustained flame under the container. Fuel was conserved because embers could be kept moderate, focused on heating stones rather than supporting open boiling. The cycle also allowed rest between actions. The cook's movements became repetitive and calm, matching the slow pace of the environment and reducing stress during long cold hours. Controlling the simmer was part of the skill. A gentle simmer softened food and extracted fat without tearing ingredients apart. A violent boil created foam, splashing, and unnecessary heat loss. People learned to manage temperature by altering the number of hot stones and the timing of replacements. If the broth grew too active, fewer stones were used or cooled stones were left longer before replacement. This created stability. Cooking became less about constant stirring and more about steady observation. Quiet control preserved the container and produced a more consistent result. Stone boiling helped unlock nourishment from difficult materials. Tough cuts that were unpleasant when roasted could become soft in broth. Bones and cartilage gave up richness over time. Marrow could be warmed and loosened, making it easier to eat. Fat melted into the liquid, carrying energy that mattered deeply in cold climates. These benefits did not come from stones themselves, but from Allah allowing heat to transfer and food to transform through ordinary processes. The method respected scarcity by making use of parts that might otherwise be wasted. Broth also supported sharing and pacing. A pot-like vessel of soup could feed several people, distributing warmth evenly. Liquid meals were easier for elders or tired bodies, requiring less chewing and less effort. Stone boiling therefore served comfort as well as survival. The steady warmth of broth could quiet the body after exposure to cold. This did not create permanent safety, but it offered a temporary easing. A warm meal could turn a harsh night into something manageable, at least for a while, until conditions changed again. Another advantage was reduced smoke in enclosed areas. Because the container did not sit on the fire, cooking could happen slightly away from heavy smoke, while stones were heated in a controlled hearth. This separation improved air quality near the eating space. Less smoke meant clearer eyes and calmer breathing. The hearth could remain modest and sheltered, supporting embers without dramatic flames. This made stone boiling useful when weather forced people into tighter spaces. The method balanced warmth and ventilation, supporting rest while food cooked quietly nearby. Safety concerns were always present. Stones could crack, water could splash, and steam could burn skin. People reduced risk by selecting proven stones, heating them gradually, and lowering them gently into liquid. Containers were placed on stable surfaces, sometimes cushioned with snow or hide to prevent tipping. Children were kept back from the hottest area. These precautions were practical and consistent. A single injury in winter could affect the group's ability to travel or gather fuel. Stone boiling therefore encouraged careful habits, turning cooking into a controlled routine rather than a chaotic moment. Efficiency mattered, especially when fuel was limited. Heating stones concentrated fire use into a single purpose. A modest hearth could keep several stones cycling without consuming large wood supplies. The container stayed insulated from direct flame, reducing damage and extending usability. This efficiency allowed cooking to continue even when conditions made large fires unwise. Stone boiling transformed small embers into extended heat through repetition. It used time as an ingredient. When time was available, fuel could be stretched further, preserving resources for other needs. Stone boiling often worked best with cooperation. One person could manage the hearth, keeping stones warming and embers steady. Another could watch the container, adjusting the simmer and handling ingredients. This division reduced fatigue and mistakes. Cooperation also allowed smoother pacing. Tasks flowed in a quiet sequence instead of overlapping in confusion. In cold environments, coordinated effort conserved warmth because fewer movements were wasted. Shared work made meals more predictable, and predictability reduced stress, helping the group settle into calmer routines during long nights. After cooking, stones needed attention. Hot stones removed from broth were set aside to cool safely. They were not thrown into snow suddenly, because rapid cooling could crack them and reduce future usefulness. Once cooled, stones were cleaned of residue and stored where they stayed dry. Containers were wiped and aired to prevent moisture damage. These maintenance steps preserved the system. Stone boiling depended on reuse. When tools and stones stayed functional, the method remained reliable, reducing future fuel demands and lowering the risk of last-minute improvisation. Sensory cues guided timing. Steam rising steadily suggested stable heat. A quiet bubbling sound indicated simmer. Changes in smell signaled when fat had rendered or when meat softened. The cook relied on these cues more than visual changes, especially in low light. Tasting was possible but minimal, used carefully to avoid waste. Food readiness was judged by texture and aroma. This sensory cooking aligned with the slow atmosphere of a sheltered hearth, where small signs mattered. Paying attention to subtle cues made cooking calmer and reduced sudden decisions. When the broth was ready, the result was gentle and practical. Food emerged softened, fat enriched the liquid, and warmth could be shared without rushing. The container remained intact because it had been protected from direct flame. The fire could be reduced because cooking no longer required intense heat. After the meal, embers were preserved for night, stones were set aside, and the space returned to stillness. Stone boiling did not create lasting comfort, but it offered enough warmth and nourishment for the present moment, before cold and time continued their quiet work. In a frozen world, hearth roasting was one of the most direct ways to turn raw food into warmth, yet it demanded restraint rather than drama. Bright flames looked impressive but wasted fuel and cooked unevenly, while embers offered steady heat that could be guided with patience. Fire was treated as a useful means only by Allah's permission, so it was approached with care, not display. Roasting began once a bed of coals formed, because coals held heat longer and produced less smoke. The purpose was simple: warm food evenly, keep it safe to eat, and spend as little fuel as possible while the cold waited just beyond the shelter. The hearth was prepared specifically for roasting. Fresh fuel was allowed to burn down until the flame settled and a glowing bed of coals appeared. Those coals were raked into a shallow, even layer so heat spread across a wider area. This reduced hot spots that could scorch the outside while leaving the inside cold. If wind threatened the coals, a low shield of stones or packed snow was built to calm the airflow. A roasting hearth was usually modest in size, because control mattered more than height or brightness. When the coal bed was even, attention could move from the fire to the food with less worry. Skewers were simple tools made from straight sticks, forked branches, or shaped bone, chosen for strength and ease of turning. A good skewer felt smooth in the hand and held food firmly without tearing it. Some were lightly notched near the tip so meat would not slide as it softened. Wet wood could steam and weaken, so skewers were often dried near embers before use. Nothing about these tools was decorative. They existed to prevent one costly mistake: dropping food into ash or snow. In scarcity, that single mistake meant wasted effort and a colder meal. The tip was refreshed when it dulled, keeping turning smooth and secure. Food was prepared with roasting in mind, because thick chunks cooked unevenly over coals. Meat was sliced into strips or flattened pieces so warmth could reach the center without burning the surface. Fish might be split along the spine, allowing heat to move through the flesh steadily. Fatty edges were kept when possible, since fat helped prevent drying and added energy. Portions were arranged in a planned order, quick pieces first, slower pieces later, matching the strength of the coals. This planning reduced fuel use and reduced stress. Pieces waiting to roast were kept close to gentle warmth so they stayed workable. Distance from the coals mattered more than any single trick. Too close, and the surface charred quickly. Too far, and food stiffened in the cold before it cooked. Heat was tested with a cautious hand held above the coals, feeling for steady warmth that did not bite. This simple test guided placement better than sight, especially in low light. Skewers hovered in a narrow band where heat was strong but gentle. Finding that band was learned through practice, and once found, roasting became calmer and more predictable. A small shift of the wrist could change everything, so movement stayed slow and deliberate. Turning was done calmly and often, not because people enjoyed repetition, but because it kept heat even and prevented burning. A skewer might be rotated a small amount every few moments, letting each side warm gradually. Steady turning also helped fat melt slowly rather than drip suddenly and flare. The cook watched for subtle signs, a slight tightening of the surface, a soft change in smell, and a quiet hiss when fat met the coals. Each sign suggested a small adjustment, not a sudden reaction. Roasting required steady hands more than strong arms. This steady motion was easier on tired arms and helped the cook stay relaxed. Fat dripping onto coals created brief sounds and sometimes small flames, and these were treated as information. A quick hiss suggested the skewer was close enough to render fat, while a flare suggested it was too close or the coal bed was too concentrated. When flare happened, the skewer was lifted, and the coals were spread to let the flame die without panic. This reduced smoke and prevented soot from coating the food. Managing fat mattered because fat was valuable nourishment. The aim was to render it gently into the food or capture it without wasting it in sudden bursts. Calm responses preserved both flavor and fuel. Smoke control shaped roasting choices. Damp fuel produced thick smoke that irritated eyes and made food taste harsh. For roasting, people preferred clean coals, so they waited until smoke thinned before placing food. If smoke returned, airflow was adjusted by shifting a stone shield, moving food slightly higher, or relocating the skewer to the edge of the hearth. Roasting at the edge reduced smoke exposure while still providing warmth. This mattered near shelters, where heavy smoke could disrupt breathing and make rest difficult. Cleaner roasting also kept the working area calmer and more comfortable. It also kept soot from settling on skin and clothing in tight spaces. Different foods asked for different heat. Fish cooked well with steady warmth and minimal turning once the skin firmed. Lean meat needed gentler heat and more frequent turning to avoid drying. Bones with marrow were placed near coals until the marrow softened, then removed before the outside scorched. Small birds or thin strips required quick attention because they could overcook easily. These differences were learned through repeated meals, not written rules. Knowing them reduced waste. When each item received the right heat, fuel spent returned more nourishment. Even simple shellfish or small organs could be warmed gently without drying. Cold air could freeze food quickly if it was set down, so finished pieces were kept in the fire's warm halo rather than placed on snow or bare stone. A warmed flat rock or a clean hide bundle could hold cooked portions while they waited to be eaten. This prevented food from becoming stiff and unpleasant, and it reduced the need to reheat. Managing warmth after roasting was as important as roasting itself, because a warm meal stayed comforting only while it stayed warm. This gentle holding system also made sharing easier, letting portions stay ready without rushing. Small habits like this saved fuel and kept the meal calm. Roasting was usually done in small batches, because crowding too much food over coals blocked airflow and created uneven heat. Small batches were easier to turn, easier to monitor, and less likely to burn. While one batch roasted, the next portions could be prepared or gently thawed nearby. This pacing matched limited fuel, because coals could be maintained steadily rather than forced into a large blaze. Batch roasting also reduced mistakes. A single burnt piece mattered more in scarcity, so smaller groups of food protected the outcome. With fewer pieces at once, the cook could keep a steady pace without tension. Reflected heat could be used to improve efficiency. A flat stone placed behind the coals bounced warmth forward, creating a hotter zone without adding fuel. Low stone walls around the hearth held heat close and reduced loss to wind. These simple arrangements helped when coals were weak or when food needed a gentle finish. They were not complex engineering, just careful observation repeated over time. Using reflected heat meant the same fuel produced more useful warmth. In cold conditions, small improvements mattered because they reduced the need for extra gathering trips and reduced exposure to wind. Hearth roasting depended on a few supporting tools. A small stone blade or scraper trimmed portions to the right size before they met the coals. A forked stick shifted coals without burning hands, keeping the heat bed even. A flat piece of wood or hide provided a clean surface for holding finished food. Keeping tools close reduced unnecessary movement, conserving body heat. Tools were cleaned promptly, because residue froze quickly and made later use difficult. This quiet maintenance supported the whole cooking system, making each meal easier than the last. Order near the hearth was a kind of efficiency. The cook relied on senses rather than measurements. Smell signaled when fat warmed and when browning began. Touch, used cautiously, suggested firmness and redness. Sound revealed the state of the coals. A steady crackle meant stable heat, while sudden silence suggested fading embers. Sight helped, but in low light it was secondary. This sensory approach suited the environment, where tools were limited and conditions changed quickly. Paying attention to subtle cues kept decisions gentle. Instead of chasing perfect timing, the cook followed small signs and adjusted in quiet increments. This made roasting steady rather than stressful. Weather could interrupt roasting, and flexibility mattered. A sudden gust might brighten coals and risk scorching, while falling snow could dampen the hearth's edge. When that happened, food was moved slightly higher, coals were gathered closer, or a shield was rebuilt. These changes were made calmly, because rushing stirred ash and wasted heat. Accepting interruption prevented frustration. The hearth was never perfectly stable, so roasting skill included adapting without drama. A cook who stayed calm protected food better than a cook who reacted sharply. Calm adjustments helped keep the meal dependable when conditions shifted. Roasting also affected posture and placement around the hearth. Sitting too close overheated hands while leaving the back cold, and sitting too far made turning awkward. People shifted position gradually, keeping the working hand warm enough to control the skewer. A stable seat reduced shaking and reduced the chance of dropping food. If the wind changed, the body might move to stay in the calmer pocket of air behind a stone shield. These small movements were part of the method. Comfort was not luxury, it supported precision. Often the cook repositioned the body slightly to stay out of the strongest draft. Sharing shaped roasting routines. When several people ate, batches were timed so warmth arrived steadily rather than all at once. This prevented food from cooling while waiting and reduced the need for reheating. Portions could be handed out as they finished, keeping everyone comfortable without demanding extra fuel. Shared eating also meant shared attention. Someone might hold a windbreak, another might prepare the next skewer, and another might watch the coals. Cooperation reduced mistakes and fatigue. The hearth became a quiet center where small tasks flowed smoothly without noise or hurry. This shared rhythm kept the hearth peaceful, even when hunger was present. After roasting, the hearth was reset with care. Coals were gathered and covered with ash to preserve heat for later, and stones were returned to their windbreak positions. Skewers were cleaned and dried, then stored where they would not absorb moisture. These steps protected tomorrow's warmth. In cold environments, continuity was built from small routines, not from grand gestures. Resetting the hearth also signaled a shift toward rest. With the meal finished, the fire could quiet down, holding just enough heat to support the next cycle of work and sleep. Hearth roasting influenced how people planned fuel use. Because roasting worked best with coals, cooking often happened when a fire had already been burning for warmth, tool work, or drying materials. Instead of wasting those coals, they were used for food at the right moment. This clustered activities around one fire cycle, reducing the need to relight and rebuild. Efficient timing made fuel last longer and created a predictable pattern. Gather fuel, build fire, let it settle, roast food, then preserve embers. Predictability reduced stress and made the day feel manageable even when conditions were harsh. Roasting also shaped how food was portioned and stored. Pieces intended for roasting were cut thin and grouped in small bundles so they could cook quickly over coals. This reduced exposure to cold during cooking and reduced fuel needed to thaw thick blocks. Roasting therefore encouraged earlier planning during preparation and storage. Each step supported the next, forming a chain of careful decisions. The hearth was not isolated. It was part of a broader system that included tool care, fuel management, and protected cooking spaces. When the chain was strong, meals were calmer and waste was lower. Mistakes were remembered because they were costly. Burned food was not simply unpleasant. It represented wasted fuel and wasted effort. Food dropped into ash could sometimes be cleaned, but it still meant extra work and lost warmth. These outcomes encouraged restraint and attention. Over time, cooks learned to avoid overconfidence, keeping heat modest and movement steady. The hearth rewarded humility in a practical way. Humility meant acknowledging limits and working within them, so that a simple meal could be prepared reliably. In harsh conditions, reliability mattered more than perfection, and calm technique protected that reliability. Even when roasting succeeded, it did not promise comfort for long. Coals cooled, and food cooled quickly in the air. The value of roasting was in providing a short window of warmth and nourishment, enough to support the next tasks and the next rest period. The hearth offered what it could, when it could, by Allah's permission through heat and fuel. When the meal ended, coals were covered, tools were set aside, and the cooking space returned to quiet. No strong ending was needed. The routine simply paused, ready to begin again when conditions allowed. In a frozen world, pit cooking turned the ground into a quiet helper, because earth and stone could hold heat long after flames settled down. Instead of keeping a large fire roaring for hours, people stored warmth underground and let time do the work. Heat only benefits people by Allah's permission through simple physical means, and pit cooking used those means with restraint. This method suited harsh wind and deep cold, where exposed flames struggled and fuel was precious. The result was slow, even cooking that softened tough food and kept moisture inside. Pit cooking was not quick, but it was steady, and steadiness mattered when everything else felt uncertain. Choosing a pit location was the first careful decision, because the wrong spot wasted effort before cooking even began. People avoided low areas where meltwater collected, since moisture stole heat and could collapse walls. They also avoided loose, powdery snow that shifted easily. Slightly raised ground worked better, especially near a natural windbreak like a rock face or a small ridge. Soil that felt firm underfoot held shape better than brittle crusted ice. The best location was stable, sheltered, and easy to return to. A pit that stayed intact made cooking calmer, because rebuilding in cold conditions drained strength quickly. The pit itself was usually shallow, because digging deep in frozen ground was expensive in energy and time. A shallow pit trapped heat while remaining easier to manage and reopen. People cleared surface snow first, then worked the ground with stone, bone, or sturdy wood tools. The shape was practical rather than perfect. A rounded base held stone securely, and sides sloped enough to resist collapse. They removed sharp ice chunks that could puncture wrapping later. Even during digging, they thought ahead to the next steps. A well-shaped pit reduced later problems, and reducing problems was one of the quiet goals of cooking in a frozen landscape. Stones were essential, because they served as a heat bank that the earth could not provide alone. Not every stone was suitable. Damp stones, river stones with hidden moisture, or stones with visible cracks could split when heated. People preferred dense, dry stones that had proven themselves over many uses. They learned by observation which stones held heat well and which failed. The stones were not treated as powerful. They were useful only because Allah allowed heat to move through them as it does. Choosing reliable stones prevented dangerous cracking and kept cooking predictable. Heating stones took patience, because rushing heat into a stone increased the chance of splitting. Stones were warmed near the fire first, then moved closer to the coals as they adjusted. This gradual heating let moisture escape and reduced internal stress. The hearth used for heating stones was kept controlled, because wild flames wasted fuel. Embers were better, providing steady heat without excessive smoke. People watched for warning signs like sharp popping sounds or surface flaking. A stone that showed signs of failure was removed and set aside. Slow heating matched the overall rhythm of pit cooking, where steadiness mattered more than speed. Lining the pit was like setting a quiet foundation. Heated stones were placed along the base first, then sometimes along the sides, creating a warm chamber that radiated inward. Placement was careful, because dropping stones cooled them and disturbed the pit's shape. A flat arrangement prevented food from resting on a single hot point, reducing scorching. Sometimes a thin layer of ash was added between stones to fill gaps and improve insulation. The goal was even warmth. This was not a dramatic moment, but it determined the cooking outcome. When the stone bed was stable, the pit behaved more like a gentle oven than a simple hole in the ground. Food preparation for pit cooking focused on items that benefited from long, gentle heat. Tough cuts of meat, connective tissue, and marrow bones were ideal, because slow warmth softened fibers and made eating easier. Portions were sized to cook evenly, avoiding massive blocks that might stay cold in the center. If there were plant foods available, they were cleaned and grouped to avoid being crushed. The goal was not variety for its own sake, but efficient nourishment. Since pit cooking took time, people chose ingredients that rewarded waiting. Each item was placed with intention, so the pit's stored heat would be spent wisely. Wrapping protected food from dirt and helped manage moisture. Clean leaves, bark sheets, or hide could form a barrier between food and soil. Wrapping was not sealed tightly, because trapped moisture could create steam pockets that tore coverings or made texture uneven. Instead, layers were loose and practical, keeping grit away while allowing heat to circulate gently. Wrapping also made retrieval easier, so food could be lifted out without being scattered into ash. People kept wrapping materials clean, because anything frozen into food later required extra work. In a cold environment, reducing later work was a form of comfort, and comfort supported endurance. Layering inside the pit followed a calm logic. Some pits placed a protective layer over the hot stones first, like dampened leaves or a thin bed of earth, to prevent direct scorching. Then food bundles were laid in, spaced so warmth could reach all sides. Sometimes more hot stones were placed above the food to create heat from multiple directions. This top layer had to be balanced, because too much heat above could cook surfaces faster than centers. People learned by experience how much stone heat was enough. The pit worked best when it behaved evenly, and evenness came from careful layering rather than forceful heat. Sealing the pit turned active work into waiting. Once the food was placed, the opening was covered with earth, ash, snow, or a combination, chosen based on what insulated best in that moment. The cover trapped heat and reduced airflow, keeping warmth underground. A good seal prevented wind from stealing heat and stopped snow from falling directly into the chamber. The surface often looked ordinary when finished, which helped the pit hold heat without drawing attention. From above, nothing seemed to happen. Below, warmth moved slowly through stone and air, softening food without flames. This quiet separation between action and result made pit cooking feel steady. Timing replaced constant checking, because opening the pit too often wasted heat. People relied on memory and experience to estimate how long cooking would take. The time depended on stone heat, pit depth, soil moisture, and outside temperature. In deeper cold, pits held heat longer, but initial warming could be slower. People learned not to chase certainty by reopening early. Waiting was part of the skill. During this waiting period, other tasks could continue, like repairing gear or preparing fuel. Pit cooking fit well into a day because it allowed work to be distributed calmly, rather than demanding constant attention at the hearth. Fuel efficiency was one of pit cooking's quiet strengths. A fire was needed to heat stones, but once stones were hot and the pit sealed, the main cooking continued without feeding flames. This reduced the need for long burning fires, which saved scarce fuel. It also reduced smoke and light, which could matter in exposed landscapes. By using stored heat, people stretched limited resources further. Heat, by Allah's permission, was transferred into stone and then into food. The method did not create extra warmth from nothing. It simply used what was available more carefully, turning a short fire into a long cooking period. Weather affected pit performance, so people adapted without fuss. In heavy wind, they sealed pits more tightly to reduce heat loss through airflow near the surface. In wet snow conditions, they increased insulation to protect against meltwater. If the ground was very icy, they chose shallower pits and relied more on stone placement than earth thickness. They learned that no pit behaved the same in every season. Flexibility mattered. A pit was not a fixed machine. It was a temporary arrangement that responded to conditions. The calm skill was noticing changes early and adjusting materials before sealing, because later changes were limited. Opening the pit was done slowly, because sudden exposure cooled food quickly and could cause steam to rush upward. People removed surface layers carefully, setting them aside for reuse. The first sign of success was often steam and warmth rising gently, not violently. Food bundles were lifted out with sticks or tools to protect hands. If additional heat was needed, the pit could be resealed briefly or food could be finished near embers. This finishing step was easier than starting over. Opening a pit felt like a quiet reveal, not dramatic, but satisfying. The long waiting produced a warm result, and warm results mattered deeply in cold environments. Hygiene and grit control remained important. Dirt or ash introduced into the pit could stick to food and become unpleasant to eat. Wrapping helped, but careful handling mattered too. People avoided stirring the pit interior once food was placed, because movement dislodged soil. Tools used for lifting were wiped clean. If food touched earth, it might be scraped before eating, which cost effort and warmth. In a frozen world, even small extra tasks mattered because hands cooled quickly. The calm approach was preventing dirt problems early. Prevention saved more warmth than correction, and warmth saved energy for the rest of the night. Pit cooking often worked well for communal meals, because a single pit could cook enough for several people at once. This reduced repeated fuel use and repeated preparation cycles. When food finished together, it could be shared while still warm, improving comfort without reheating. Shared timing also supported rest, because people could eat, preserve embers, and settle down without keeping fires high. The meal arrived as a gentle event rather than a rushed scramble. Cooperation mattered too. One person heated stones while another prepared wrapping. Shared work reduced fatigue and mistakes. In cold conditions, fewer mistakes meant more warmth remained for everyone. After cooking, stones were treated as reusable tools rather than disposable objects. Hot stones were set aside to cool gradually. Sudden cooling in snow could crack them and reduce future use. Once cool, stones were brushed clean and stored where they stay dry. The pit itself might be reused if the group stayed nearby, or it might be filled in to reduce hazards and leave less trace. This low-impact approach suited movement and changing camps. Pit cooking did not require permanent structures. It required knowledge and attention. Those could travel easily, even when tools were simple. Pit cooking also influenced the kinds of food people saved for later. Since the method worked best for tough materials, those parts were often reserved for pit days, while quicker foods were roasted or boiled when needed. This planning reduced waste. Tough cuts that might be unpleasant otherwise became valuable, because slow heat made them tender. In scarcity, this mattered. Cooking methods shaped what people valued and how they divided resources. The pit encouraged patience, because it turned waiting into nourishment. That patience was not passive. It was a deliberate choice that conserved fuel and improved eating quality. There were risks, and people managed them quietly. A pit sealed too loosely could lose heat and leave food undercooked. A pit sealed too tightly with wet material could create excessive steam and damage wrappings. Stones placed unevenly could scorch part of the meal. These outcomes were corrected over time through experience. The response was rarely panic. Instead, people adjusted depth, stone spacing, or insulation choice next time. Cold environments taught learning through repetition. Each pit was a lesson. Over many meals, small corrections accumulated into reliable practice. Reliability was the goal, because reliability reduced stress, and reduced stress supported rest. As the pit worked, the surface above remained still. This stillness could feel calming, because the most important work happened quietly out of sight. There was no need to stare at flames or constantly adjust fuel. The body could settle into other tasks or rest nearby, knowing warmth was slowly doing its work underground. Heat moved patiently through stone, air, and food. That movement only happens because Allah allows creation to function as it does. The pit did not promise comfort forever. It offered a temporary warmth, enough to soften food and support one more stretch of cold time. And when the last bundle was lifted out and the pit was filled or left to cool, the ground returned to silence. The warmth it held faded gradually, and the landscape remained cold and wide. Pit cooking did not conquer the environment. It worked within it. It used short fire to create long heat, careful layering to create even warmth, and waiting to create tenderness. The result was not luxury, but steadiness. Enough food prepared safely, enough warmth shared briefly, and enough calm routine to make the next night feel manageable, until the cycle began again when conditions allowed. In a frozen world, cold was not an enemy but a quiet helper. People learned to work with freezing air instead of resisting it. The cold preserved food naturally, by Allah's permission through physical processes that slowed decay and silenced insects. This cooperation with temperature allowed rest between hunts and less urgency to cook every day. But the same cold that protected food could also destroy it if handled carelessly. Frozen meat could crack, dry, or become lost beneath snow. Storage required understanding balance, cold enough to preserve, not so deep or exposed that food became unreachable. Every decision involved patience, planning, and respect for how stillness could serve survival. Food was never stored as large blocks because solid freezing made later cutting impossible. Instead, meat and fat were portioned into smaller, even pieces while still soft. Sharp tools shaped these pieces before the cold hardened them, allowing smoother thawing and measured cooking later. Each piece represented planning for the future: one meal, one share, or one day's worth of nourishment. Dividing food in advance saved time, reduced fuel, and ensured nothing was wasted. Portioning also prevented the need to reheat entire stores when only part was needed. These small efforts made survival calmer. Preparation replaced panic, and order replaced guessing. Storage locations were chosen by how well they stayed cold and stable. Shaded areas beneath rock overhangs or along north-facing slopes preserved low temperatures even when sunlight returned. In windy plains, snowbanks provided natural insulation. The ground itself became a partner in preservation. Food was placed where air moved slowly, where meltwater drained away, and where animals rarely passed. The best storage spots were discovered, not built. Their reliability came from observation repeated over seasons. People learned to read signs, how frost lingered, how snow drifted, how shadows changed, and used that knowledge to decide where their food would rest safely in silence. Elevation played an equally important role. Ground contact invited moisture and hungry scavengers, so storage was lifted whenever possible. Meat and fish hung from sturdy branches or poles driven into frozen soil, suspended above ground where cold air flowed freely. Hanging storage kept food dry and visible while reducing access for animals. Height alone was not enough. Direction mattered too. Items faced away from direct sun or wind to avoid drying unevenly. When wind grew too strong, coverings of hide or bark softened the gusts. This elevated system reduced risk, balancing exposure and protection through quiet awareness rather than complicated tools. Snow itself became part of the storage design. When packed correctly, it acted as insulation rather than simple cold. A thin layer of snow over food kept temperature steady, protecting against sudden changes from sun or storm. Food was not buried deeply, because that risked losing track of it or having it freeze beyond reach. Instead, snow was shaped gently over bundles like a blanket. Markers, stones, sticks, or simple patterns were placed nearby to help recovery later. Snow storage required patience and periodic checking, because a storm could reshape the landscape overnight. Observation was essential. Stillness worked, but stillness needed watching. Cleanliness remained important even when freezing temperatures seemed protective. Blood or dirt left on food could harden into unwanted layers that were difficult to remove later. Before storage, surfaces were wiped with clean snow or scraped gently with tools. Hides, bark, or woven mats sometimes wrapped food to separate it from soil and debris. Airtight sealing was avoided, because trapped moisture could cause ice buildup and ruin texture. Clean handling at this stage meant easier preparation later. Each act of care saved effort for the future. Clean storage was not luxury, it was efficiency, a lesson reinforced with every frozen season. Animals tested every storage system. Foxes, birds, and larger predators could smell food even through snow. Protecting supplies demanded planning more than strength. Food was distributed among multiple storage spots, so losing one did not mean total loss. Some caches were placed farther away to divert attention, while main stores stayed closer to camp. The scent of smoke or ash was sometimes brushed lightly over wrapping to confuse animals. Every defense was temporary. People accepted that risk existed and planned within it. Security came from awareness and flexibility, not from walls or force. Cold changed food's texture and behavior, shaping how it was later used. Frozen meat became brittle and required gentle thawing near coals. Rushing the process with direct flame wasted moisture and flavor. People learned to let food rest near warmth rather than in it, allowing slow transformation. Fat thawed more quickly and was often used first. Texture guided timing. Firm but pliable meant ready. Every thawing session became a quiet ritual of patience. The fire waited nearby, not consuming fuel until the food itself invited it. Slow thawing preserved nutrients and maintained calm routines, turning necessity into rhythm. Monitoring stored food was part of daily life. Even in deep cold, change could occur unnoticed. People checked storage sites for shifting snow, animal tracks, or subtle temperature differences. Rechecking reinforced security and preserved memory of placement. Forgetting a cache was a real danger, especially during long white months when landmarks vanished. To prevent loss, people aligned storage with natural patterns, following ridges, marking by rocks, or remembering how the wind shaped drifts. These simple cues replaced written records. Storage memory became part of survival memory, passed through repetition rather than teaching, keeping knowledge quiet but enduring. Seasonal change demanded flexible methods. Early winter storage prioritized insulation because snow was light and temperatures inconsistent. Deep winter storage relied more on exposure, letting consistent cold maintain preservation. In late winter, when thaw risk increased, food was relocated higher or closer to shaded areas. These shifts were done calmly and with foresight. Each adjustment prevented larger crises later. The cold itself never stayed constant, and people learned to move with it. Adaptation replaced struggle. The environment was not controlled but cooperated with, acknowledging that balance, not dominance, kept food safe. Storage influenced movement and camp placement. Groups sometimes built temporary shelters near reliable caches rather than carrying everything constantly. This reduced load and allowed easier rest during hunts or travel. Other times, food was stored along known routes, creating a chain of security through empty landscapes. These placements formed invisible maps across frozen terrain. Knowing where nourishment waited offered quiet reassurance in uncertainty. The frozen world could still feel vast and indifferent, but storage created small pockets of control. The system depended on memory, not markers alone. Losing memory meant losing comfort, so stories and habits reinforced these paths. Community shaped storage behavior. Shared food meant shared responsibility, but also shared caution. Each person needed to respect limits. Distributing food fairly required awareness of what was available, not just what was desired. This discipline created quiet trust within groups. When everyone followed the same rhythm, gather, portion, hang, check, the system worked smoothly. The cold encouraged cooperation because selfishness threatened survival. Frozen storage became a shared act of balance. Everyone relied on the same stillness to hold nourishment safely until needed. The air itself became part of the agreement, holding time steady. Accidents still occurred. Sudden thaw, storm, or scavenger intrusion could destroy a cache overnight. The response was not anger but reorganization. Food was moved, recovered, or supplemented by fresh hunting. Complaints wasted energy. Adjustment preserved it. Over time, people learned to expect some loss as part of the cycle. Nothing remained untouched forever. Acceptance of impermanence made calm easier to keep. Frozen storage worked best when approached as partnership, not perfection. A few missing meals did not mean failure. Endurance came from how people adapted, not from how tightly they tried to control the cold. Frozen storage influenced the rhythm of daily meals. Knowing food rested safely reduced anxiety, allowing people to focus on other needs. This mental relief mattered deeply during endless cold. Predictability gave shape to time. The mind could rest knowing tomorrow's meal existed somewhere near, hidden but preserved. That awareness allowed quieter evenings. Instead of urgency, there was rhythm: eat, work, check, and rest. Routine replaced worry. Frozen storage was not luxury. It was mental stability built from discipline and observation. Tools supported the storage cycle. Knives and scrapers prepared portions efficiently. Hide cords, bark sheets, and poles created hanging systems. Even small items like awls or lashings prevented collapse when wind grew strong. These tools required maintenance like any others. Keeping them dry and clean ensured readiness when food needed to be moved or rewrapped. Every piece of equipment had a place in the quiet structure of survival. The smoother the system ran, the calmer the people felt. Tools were extensions of attention, physical reminders that foresight turned cold into cooperation. Lighting conditions shaped storage work. Twilight and overcast skies softened visibility, so tasks near storage happened mostly during full daylight. The coldest times often coincided with dimmer light, so people balanced timing, checking caches when vision was clear but before midday glare created blinding reflection. Good timing prevented missteps or injury. Snow and ice amplified brightness, and too much light could fatigue the eyes as easily as too little. These visual rhythms became part of planning, guiding when to handle, hang, or move food. Observation of light matched observation of temperature, both needed for safe preservation. Scent and airflow affected quality too. Storing meat too close to strong-smelling materials like smoke or certain resins could change flavor. While smoke helped preserve, too much left bitterness. People learned to balance scent intentionally, exposing food briefly to smoke before hanging it in clean air. Wind direction decided where smoke traveled. By working with air rather than against it, people avoided contamination while gaining mild preservation benefits. Scent, like temperature, became another form of control that relied on awareness instead of force. Mastering such details kept food reliable across long seasons of cold stillness. Storage work shaped the pace of community routines. Collecting, portioning, checking, and retrieving all took predictable time each day. The tasks provided structure when daylight and darkness blurred. These repetitions reminded people that survival was a chain of small actions, not large triumphs. Frozen storage represented calm continuity, a pause in the otherwise demanding rhythm of cold life. It showed that silence could work as hard as motion. When food rested under snow, time felt slower but steadier, and people could focus on warmth, repairs, or quiet conversation without fear of sudden shortage. Frozen storage also revealed the limits of control. Even perfect technique could not prevent the seasons from turning. When spring came, the great freezer began to release its hold. Stored food softened, smells returned, and preservation faded. People planned for the shift, using remaining supplies before warmth reclaimed them. The end of freezing season was both relief and reminder. Cold had served its purpose but never belonged to them. It was a loan of stillness, returned naturally. When it passed, they adapted again, ready for new challenges that warmth would bring. And so, frozen storage turned the landscape itself into a quiet pantry. It asked for nothing but awareness and steady care. Food rested in the stillness of snow, preserved not by power but by patience. By portioning, lifting, wrapping, and checking, people shaped cooperation with the environment instead of opposition. The cold offered temporary help, not eternal promise, yet that help was enough. In this balance between freezing air and human rhythm, nourishment endured just long enough to sustain another day, another night, and another quiet beginning beneath the endless pale sky. In a frozen world, drying and wind curing offered a way to preserve food without relying on constant fire. Cold air, when paired with steady wind, slowed decay while drawing moisture out of meat and fish. This process worked only by Allah's permission through physical properties of air and temperature, not through force or heat alone. Drying reduced weight, improved portability, and extended usefulness of food across long journeys or quiet days. Unlike cooking, drying required patience rather than attention. Once set correctly, food could be left to transform slowly, while people turned to other tasks, allowing preservation to happen without urgency or heavy fuel use. Selecting the right conditions mattered more than speed. Drying worked best in cold, moving air where moisture evaporated without encouraging spoilage. Still air trapped dampness, while excessive warmth caused decay. People observed weather patterns carefully, choosing days with steady wind and low humidity. Sheltered ridges, open plains, or coastal edges often provided these conditions. Drying locations were chosen with care, because moving food after drying began disrupted the process. Placement decisions reflected experience, not guesswork. The goal was consistency. A steady environment preserved food gently, while sudden change risked loss. Preparation determined success before drying even began. Meat and fish were cut into thin, even strips so air could reach all surfaces. Thick pieces trapped moisture inside and spoiled unevenly. Cutting followed natural grain, reducing tearing and allowing strips to hang without curling excessively. Fat was trimmed carefully, because too much fat slowed drying and encouraged rancidity. Each strip was shaped with intention, balancing thickness and strength. Good preparation reduced later correction. Once hung, food was meant to remain undisturbed. Early care replaced later effort, conserving energy and reducing waste. Hanging systems were simple but deliberate. Strips were suspended from branches, cords, or poles, spaced so air could move freely between them, crowding slow drying and increased risk of spoilage. Height mattered as well. Hanging food above ground reduced contact with moisture and animals. Wind exposure was balanced against protection from snow. Sometimes light coverings softened gusts without blocking airflow. These arrangements were adjusted quietly, based on observation rather than rigid rules. The structure did not need to look impressive. It only needed to let air move gently and consistently. Sunlight played a limited role. Direct sun could warm surfaces too quickly, trapping moisture inside and damaging texture. Indirect light was preferred, allowing slow evaporation without overheating. Shaded, breezy areas worked best. People learned how sunlight shifted throughout the day and placed drying racks accordingly. The aim was balance, not brightness. Too much light accelerated problems, while too little slowed progress excessively. This sensitivity to light mirrored sensitivity to wind and temperature. Drying succeeded when all elements worked together calmly. Wind was the primary worker in this process. A steady breeze carried moisture away, preventing buildup that caused spoilage. People listened to the wind, noticing its direction and strength. Drying racks were oriented to catch consistent airflow rather than sudden gusts. If wind shifted, food was repositioned gradually. This gentle adjustment preserved structure. Wind curing depended on patience. It could not be forced. Allowing air to work slowly produced better results than chasing speed with risky placement. Cold temperatures supported drying by slowing bacterial growth. Food dried in cold air retained usability longer than food dried in warmth alone. However, extreme cold could freeze surfaces before moisture escaped. In those cases, drying paused rather than failed. Frozen strips resumed drying when conditions improved. People learned to accept this pause. Drying was not always continuous. It followed weather rather than schedule. Understanding this rhythm prevented frustration. Preservation succeeded by waiting for conditions, not by demanding them. Smoke sometimes supported drying, but it was used lightly. A brief exposure to smoke discouraged insects and added surface protection. Heavy smoking, however, altered flavor and texture excessively. People balanced smoke carefully, exposing food just enough to help preservation without overpowering it. Smoke was directed using wind rather than enclosed fires, reducing fuel use. This subtle use of smoke complemented drying rather than replacing it. Smoke was a tool, not the method itself. Monitoring dried food was essential. People checked strips regularly, feeling texture and flexibility. Properly dried food bent slightly without cracking. Too brittle meant over-drying. Too soft meant moisture remained. Adjustments were made quietly. Food was repositioned, spacing increased, or exposure reduced. These checks required attention but not constant presence. Drying allowed work to continue elsewhere, returning only for brief inspection. This efficiency mattered in cold environments, where time and warmth were always limited. Animals posed a constant threat. Drying food carried strong scents, attracting scavengers. Hanging systems were placed out of reach and away from common paths. Sometimes multiple small racks were used instead of one large cluster to reduce total loss. People accepted that some risk remained. Drying required vigilance, not perfection. Regular checks prevented large losses. The system relied on awareness rather than barriers. Once dried, food was stored differently from fresh supplies. Dried strips were lighter and less sensitive to freezing, making them easier to transport. They were bundled and wrapped to protect from moisture. Storage locations remained dry and shaded. Dried food did not require constant cold, but still benefited from cool conditions. These supplies provided flexibility, supporting travel and emergency needs. Dried food changed how meals were prepared. It could be eaten directly, softened near warmth, or added to broth. This versatility reduced fuel demand. Small amounts provided significant nourishment. Drying therefore supported efficiency across the entire food system. Preservation influenced cooking choices and planning. Drying favored lean meats and fish. Fatty items required careful trimming. Experience taught which foods dried well and which were better cooked immediately. Knowledge accumulated slowly. Mistakes refined practice. Weather interruptions were common. Rain, snow, or calm air paused drying. Food was covered or moved temporarily. These interruptions were expected, not alarming. Drying resumed when conditions allowed. Drying reduced urgency. Knowing food could last eased daily pressure. This mental relief mattered deeply. Predictability supported calm routines. Tools for drying were simple. Cords, poles, and hooks required maintenance. Clean materials prevented contamination. Drying supported sharing. Portable food allowed distribution during travel or scarcity. It supported group resilience. Flavor changed during drying. Concentration intensified taste. People adapted expectations. Dried food was practical, not indulgent. Drying demanded patience. Results appeared slowly. Waiting was part of success. The process taught restraint. Rushing spoiled food. Calm preserved it. And so, through wind and cold, food transformed quietly. Drying did not promise comfort, but it offered endurance. By allowing air to work patiently, people preserved nourishment just long enough to support another journey, another winter, and another quiet continuation of life in the frozen world. In a frozen world, the act of eating was never rushed or dramatic, because food represented more than nourishment. It was warmth, recovery, and a pause in hardship. Meals often gathered people close to the hearth, where heat remained steady and movement slowed naturally. Eating together reduced exposure to cold and allowed fuel to be used efficiently. The shared meal created calm, not celebration. There was no excess, only enough. This quiet approach reflected understanding that comfort arrived in small, temporary moments. The bowl or shared space around the food became a center of stability, where bodies warmed and attention softened after long hours of cold effort. Sharing food followed unspoken rules shaped by necessity rather than ceremony. Portions were distributed with awareness of need. Those who had worked hardest, those who were younger, older, or recovering from cold, often received food earlier or warmer. This was not hierarchy, but practicality. Survival required balance. Ensuring everyone remained capable mattered more than strict equality. These decisions were rarely debated. Experience guided distribution quietly. The shared bowl reflected responsibility rather than ownership, reminding everyone that food existed to support the group, not individual desire. The order of eating mattered. Food that cooled quickly was eaten first. Broths were sipped while steam still rose. Solid foods were passed carefully, not piled or hoarded. Hands moved slowly to avoid spills, because spilled food meant lost warmth. People ate close to the hearth, minimizing movement. This reduced heat loss and preserved energy. Eating posture mattered too. Sitting low, close to warmth, conserved body heat. The act of eating became part of thermal management, not separate from it. Each movement was deliberate, shaped by cold. Conversation during meals was often quiet or minimal. Eating required attention, especially when hands were stiff and food hot. Silence supported safety and allowed people to focus on warming themselves. When words were spoken, they were brief and practical. Loud speech wasted energy and disrupted calm. The shared bowl created a peaceful atmosphere, where presence mattered more than expression. This quietness was not emptiness. It was comfort through shared stillness. The group rested together, allowing the body to absorb warmth and nourishment without distraction. Utensils were simple or absent. Hands, small tools, or shared implements moved carefully between food and mouth. Cleanliness was maintained to prevent freezing residue on fingers. People warmed hands between bites when needed. Eating took time. Rushing caused discomfort and wasted warmth. The slow pace supported digestion and calm. Meals ended naturally, not when food ran out abruptly, but when warmth faded and hunger eased. The shared bowl did not encourage fullness, only sufficiency. Leftovers were handled with care. Food that remained warm might be shared again or set aside near embers to prevent freezing. Nothing edible was discarded casually. Portions were adjusted based on remaining supplies. This flexibility allowed planning for later meals. Eating was never isolated from storage decisions. Each meal informed the next. The shared bowl was part of a larger cycle that included preparation, cooking, and preservation. Understanding this cycle reduced anxiety. Food became predictable, even when conditions were harsh. Children learned meal behavior through observation. They watched how elders waited, how portions were taken, and how hands moved carefully. Instruction was rarely needed. Repetition taught respect for food and warmth. This learning preserved habits across generations. The shared bowl became a quiet classroom, where behavior reinforced survival without formal teaching. Calm routines passed forward naturally, ensuring continuity of practice. Elders often guided meal pacing through example. They ate slowly, paused often, and adjusted posture near warmth. This modeled restraint. Younger members followed unconsciously. The group moved together in rhythm, reducing wasted movement. This coordination conserved heat and reduced risk. Eating became synchronized without instruction, shaped by shared environment rather than rules. The shared meal also offered emotional stability. After exposure to cold and effort, sitting together reduced isolation. Even without conversation, presence mattered. Bodies warmed together. Breathing slowed. The mind rested briefly. These moments helped prevent exhaustion from becoming despair. The shared bowl offered reassurance that effort had meaning, even if comfort was temporary. Meals were timed carefully. Eating too early wasted warmth before rest. Eating too late risked sleeping cold. The group learned optimal timing through experience. This timing supported better sleep and recovery. Eating aligned with natural rhythms rather than clocks. The hearth guided timing more than hunger alone. Food texture influenced sharing. Soft foods were easier to divide evenly. Broth flowed easily between hands. Hard foods were cut into manageable pieces before sharing. This preparation reduced struggle during eating. Ease mattered. The less effort required, the more warmth remained. Sharing emphasized ease rather than quantity. The shared bowl reduced competition. When food was scarce, calm distribution prevented conflict. Everyone understood limits. Trust replaced fear. This trust mattered deeply. Without it, survival systems failed. Shared eating reinforced cooperation beyond the meal itself. Even during scarcity, fairness was maintained through awareness. No one took more than needed. Overeating was impractical. Excess created discomfort and wasted energy. Moderation supported endurance. The shared bowl reflected discipline shaped by environment. After meals, the group often lingered briefly near warmth. This allowed digestion and preserved heat. Movements remained slow. Eventually, tasks resumed or rest began. The meal ended quietly, without announcement. Transition was gentle. Eating together also reduced fuel use. One fire served many. Shared warmth replaced individual heating. This efficiency mattered over long winters. The shared bowl supported collective survival. As seasons passed, meal routines remained familiar even when locations changed. Familiarity reduced stress. Predictable behavior comforted the mind. The shared bowl anchored routine in uncertainty. The act of sharing reinforced humility. Food was never guaranteed. Gratitude appeared through careful handling rather than words. Each meal acknowledged dependence on provision allowed by Allah through effort, environment, and patience. The shared bowl never promised abundance. It promised continuity. Enough warmth, enough nourishment, for now. That was sufficient. As this final segment settles, you may imagine the quiet after a meal in a frozen world. The fire softens. Breathing slows. Hands rest. The shared bowl is empty, but warmth lingers briefly. And so, as the hearth dims and the night stretches outward, this story comes to a gentle close. Thank you for listening to this quiet journey through how people prepared food in a frozen world. May the calm rhythm of these small routines help your thoughts grow still, your breathing slow, and your rest arrive naturally. Thank you for spending this time here, and may your night be peaceful and warm.